All right, folks, and we're live. So today on Inside.net, Rodney and I decided we wanted to talk about containers. Containers is in Docker containers and not shipping containers. I know nothing about shipping containers, but in that aspect, we've been talking a little bit back and forth, and Rodney was like, "Hey, I don't really use containers. That's not a thing that's in my regular workflow." And I'm like, "Well, I use containers almost weekly." Right. And so it's almost like we build different types of apps. We have different types of experiences. So I wanted to take a moment to show Rodney what it kind of feels like using container. How do I use them? Why do I use them? And then kind of talk about like some of those different use cases and obviously answer some of your questions as well. So that's what we're going to do today. So actually, Rodney, I would actually love if why don't we just go this way? Because again, like you're the new person, right? So why don't you tell me like do you know what a container is? Is it something that's completely confusing for you, or because I'm trying to gauge how do you want us to start this?
So how about this? I'll define what I believe a container to be, and you can throw that around and show me what it actually is, right? So as I understand a container, right? So like I come from so let's back up and go back in the Wayback Machine and talk about like back when we used to have physical servers, right? I used to have to provision machines, deploy, like configure IIS just correct for every single application. So after that came the concept of virtual machines and then like VMware and like the VM space, right? And as I understand it today, a container, not specifically a Docker container, but a container is a self-contained environment that can be pre-configured to have certain dependencies pre-installed, certain configuration already established, and it just sits there in like some type of ISO image file, and you just load it, and it reduces all of the time it used to take for me, the literal days that it used to take for me to provision a web server, down to seconds.
That's pretty accurate around like how people use containers for sure. Okay. Yeah, you're not wrong at all. You think about so you know more than you think you know. See, it's always good when people validate that.
Knowing about the thing and using the thing are completely different.
That is different. That's true. I know we're going to show you how you could use it.
Awesome.
But yeah, I agree with you. The way I look at containers is just a way for me to achieve like process isolation. At least the way that I use it. I think everyone, with technology, like everyone uses technology in a different way. I use it particularly for process isolation, meaning like kind of like you said, like I can have a self-contained environment and I can run one or many of them. And it just kind of makes it easier for me to manage for a couple of reasons. And again, I'm just talking about my use cases. So when I think about what I have to do before, right, I have to put on the old man hat a little bit. Back in my day, what I used to do was, when I worked at a company, I was actually writing software for, releases and stuff like that. I used to have to go ask or put in a ticket to get a VM provisioned for me to deploy and test my thing, right? Now, some of you folks might relate to this, but back in the day, like Windows licenses, because I was deploying to Windows licenses weren't cheap, and so asking for a VM wasn't okay, Cecil, I'll get you a VM. It was I'm going to put in the ticket and I'll get it in like 2 weeks, right? Because we had to go through procurement, and then they had to set it up, and then they had to apply the security policies, and then I had to get access to it, and stuff had to happen, right? And rightfully so, because you just want to spin up things and loosely throw money around, and then again, security is an important thing for you to think about, right? But then that was all that had to happen for me to just deploy something to test, right? Like we didn't have persistence test environments. And again, this is a long time ago. I know the world for a lot of people is different, but I'm just telling you, for me, that's what the world looked like at the time, right? And so then, we moved on to the space of where people had just like pools of VMs, and then, but even in that case, you're still talking about deploying to an environment that's one, over the network, and then two, probably does not look like what your machine looks like, right? So meaning that it might not be the same version of the operating system. It might not have the same version of .NET on the operating system. It might not have the same dependencies, right? Like I know a lot of folks, again, a previous company I used to work at, use certain versions of TypeScript, use certain versions of Python, like different versions of things that were dependencies of my app. And I don't know, I go to sleep, but I wake up and my app rebooted because it needed to apply updates. Now there might be a version mismatch, an operating system mismatch, a dependency mismatch between what's on my machine or what's on the thing that I'm deploying to. Again, just giving context about what my role used to look like.
Yeah, well, because you didn't own everything, right? So because you don't own the process, and you can't guarantee that what you're deploying to looks like what you want it to look like.
Yeah. Right. I can't guarantee the consistency of the environment, right? Like I had no control over it.
None.
And then again, this is all for me to deploy one app, right? And so no, we're talking about an entire virtual machine, which, if folks have installed virtual machines before, know that you're talking about multiple gigs of space and of accounts and setup and like stuff that needs to happen. And setting up a VM is not like click, okay. It's okay, I'm gonna go spin this up, I'm gonna go have lunch, maybe be done in like 2 hours, right? Like it takes time, right? So there's the time, there's the setup, there's the licensing, there's so many things you have to think about just to say, hey, I want to deploy this thing so I could test it, right? With containers, it makes it a little bit easier for me now because one, it's in isolation and I can run it on my machine. When I run the container on my machine and in, I don't know, the host, wherever it is, in the cloud, on a VM somewhere, wherever, it's the same environment, right? Like, because I can control the consistency of that environment. And then also too, it's like a fraction of the size of a VM. You know what I mean? Okay, and that's any VM. It's not a Windows or a Linux thing. A container is always going to be a fraction of the size of your VM.
Right, because it doesn't take any of the additional stuff to set it up, right? It doesn't take any of the additional boilerplate install gigabits of cruft that comes along with it.
It doesn't need all of that other stuff.
Right.
And so again, I think about a container as like a way for me to run processes in isolation. It's a way for me to try out new tools and services on my machine without messing around with my file system. Because tell me, I'm sure y'all know, y'all have gone and installed software. And even after you've uninstalled it, like one day you're navigating around, exploring, you'll be like, hey, I thought I deleted this thing, right? It's leaving artifacts. It's leaving this like it's dirty laundry around in my file system. And I don't want that, right? If you're like me and you have like opinions about keeping your hard drive clean, like I do, you're probably like, hey, if I uninstall something, I want it to be gone. I don't want it to leave behind like remnants of the fact that it was here, right? So again, me being able to run things in containers gives me the ability to do that. It just kind of makes it a little bit easier for me. And so what I kind of wanted to do was I'm going to share my screen first. But what I wanted to do was show what it was like to actually create a container in .NET. And I'm going to see. I want y'all to time me because I feel like I can do this. Actually, never mind. Don't time me.
Oh, I was going to say, look, I got a timer right here. Right here.
We're gonna do it. We're gonna do it in about 5 minutes or so, right? We're gonna create a container, run it, and get it running. But then we're gonna have a conversation about what did I just create? Like what is all this stuff that's now in front of me, right? Like what am I looking at? Right. So let's go over to. I'm gonna do this in VS Code because why not?
Because you're fancy.
Because we're fancy. We're going to do this in VS Code. Let me do this. I want to make this. Let me make sure that this terminal, okay, make sure that that's big enough for folks to see.
Side note, while you're getting that set up, have you seen Fleet? Have you played with that at all?
I have not, and I want to.
I installed it, and I'm trying to basically replace VS Code with it for like a 3-month period to see how I like it. So
yeah, I've been trying to I've been like in conference mode all week, and I'm like, the minute I get a second, like I want to sit down and try it out.
Take a breath. Install.
Okay, so I'm gonna create this new directory. Right? Let me say mkdir. Let's just call this Docker test, right? So we talked about containers. Like Docker is just like one. I'm probably the most common and probably the first. Most popular, most visible container runtime. There are more runtimes other than Docker, but Docker is just like the most common one. So on my machine already, just for context for folks, I already have Docker Desktop installed. Docker Desktop runs on Windows and Linux. I'm sorry, Windows and Mac. If you're on a Linux machine, you don't need Docker Desktop, to be honest with you, and there's technical reasons why that's the case, but Linux, just like for many other things, has better support natively for Docker than Mac and Windows does, and so they don't need Docker Desktop. You can just install it on runtime, and then you can have it. So anyway, I'm just saying that to say I have Docker installed on my machine. If I do Docker -x version, you could see like the version of Docker I have on my machine. The version is not important, but I'm just letting you know like I have stuff installed already, right? It's ready to go. Okay, so I'm in this folder. I'm just going to do a .NET new. Let's do that in new web API, I guess. Dash minimal. Yeah, let's do that. That new minimal. Let's just call this Docker test. Yeah, and then I wanted to go here, right? Location. Oh, I think you have to do a dash O output. Put it right here, right? So I'm gonna go ahead. It's gonna spin up some stuff. .NET run, and I should be able to. Excuse me. I should be able to have a thing running on my machine, and I'm just gonna make a web request on it. Uh-oh, keychain. Hold on. Let me move. Oh, you know what this is? Deny. This is that because it's running like those SSL certificates.
Mm-hmm.
It always does that. Anyway, where are we? So I am running on. I should be running on 2 ports. No, where's the other one? Okay, here's the HTTPS one. Right? If I go to curl, I have curl on my machine. That's handy for making web requests. If I do this, I think it's /weather forecast is the default thing. Certificate problem. So this is why I don't like using certificates sometimes. Let's do this. I am going to let's do this. I am going to. So now I got to go through this whole thing of like trusting the certificate and all that nonsense. I don't really want to do all of that. No. So what I'm going to do, lazy developer that I am, I'm just going to delete all this stuff that's inside of this launch settings.json. Has nothing to do with Docker. I'm just telling y'all what I'm doing. Usually this is what I do because I run on a Mac and I really don't care about all this IIS stuff. Like I haven't run anything in IIS since like, I don't know, 2010. Like I just don't deal with IIS.
Yeah.
But I'm also going to remove this section here that says HTTPS because I don't want it to have that HTTPS URL. I don't need any of this stuff, right? So when I do my launch JSON file, which again is a file that lets the runtime know how to run the project from a web perspective, this is how I like to have it, right? I have to like it clean and minimal and all that IIS stuff. I don't like it. I'm also going to come in here and turn off HTTPS redirection because what that does is it redirects you to the HTTP endpoint, and I just removed it. So I don't want it to redirect me to a place that no longer exists. So I've just deleted that. So I've deleted a little bit of code in the sense of simplicity. And I think, remember, we were talking the other day about like when I install templates, how I like to go in and just start deleting stuff. Well, that's what you're watching me do now. I go in and I usually start deleting stuff as like one of the first orders of business, right?
Yeah.
Now, all right, so back to business. Let's do .NET run. I should be running now. I should be only running on one endpoint now as this goes up, right? I'm only at 5009. And then now I should be able to do curl this /weather forecast. There you go, right? And I get stuff back. If you want it to look pretty, I'm getting distracted. If you want it to look pretty, there's this package that I like to use called JQ. Have you ever heard about JQ?
No, teach me.
So I'm going to install JQ right now because this is a new machine and I haven't installed anything on it. New as in like I just formatted it and I haven't like reinstalled a lot of stuff on it yet.
Got it.
So what JQ does is essentially just makes it look pretty, to be honest with you. Like it makes your I already have it. Great. So if I do that and I pipe it into I type this command into JQ, right? Ta-da! See how pretty that looks in your terminal now?
Oh man, that just blew my mind.
And I just sent it to JQ, right? So again, it's a little bit easier to read than the alternative, which is this, right? You can have this or you can have this, right? Pick and choose. Anyway, all of this just to show you that I'm able to run this on my machine. This has nothing to do with containers, right? Now, because I have this open in VS Code, and I do have the VS Code extension for .NET installed, what I do want to do is I have this command. Notice I have this command that says add Docker files to workspace. So I'm just going to click on that, right? And that's a part of the extension. Notice I have these different languages I can choose, .NET, ASP.core. I'm going to select that one. Windows, Linux, definitely want it to be on Windows. I have a Windows machine next to me. And notice how it automatically picked up that port that we're running on. Great, fantastic. And do I want Docker Compose files? Not yet. We'll talk about what Docker Compose is later. Let's make this a little bit smaller. Now this is your Docker file, right? Now, The Microsoft Docker files have a lot of stuff in there. Some of the stuff you don't need, some of the stuff you do need. And we're going to talk about what's inside of this file. But for now, I want you to think that, okay, I have some instructions of how to build a Docker image, right? So again, when you think about containers, a container is like the thing that's running your process, right? And the image is like the templates or the blueprints for that thing to be created. So in .NET worlds, an image is like a class and a container is like an instance of the class, if that makes sense, right?
Yep.
So I might have a person class, right? That's my image in Docker world. And then I say Cecil equals new person. That's my container that's running, right?
Right.
So again, to kind of put that into perspective. All right. So right now I have this Docker file that I have. What I'm going to do with this Docker file now is I have to build an image. I keep doing Control plus because I'm trying to make this bigger so y'all can see the terminal. So I'm going to do Docker build, right? I'm going to tell it the Docker file I wanted to build. So I wanted to build this thing that says Docker file, right? Again, and this is the Docker file that was created from the extension, right? And then I want to give it a name, right? The way that we name Docker files, you call it tagging, but tagging and name is the same thing, right? I want to give this thing a name. And let's just call this, I'll just call this Docker test, right? That's the name of my thing. And then I have to tell it where is, what's the context. So I wanted to build here. Now, what this is doing is that it's looking at the instructions that are inside of the Docker file, right? Because remember I told you the Docker file kind of tells how to build the image. Mm-hmm. And now it's building stuff, right? Again, we're going to talk about the Docker file a little bit more in a second. But again, I'm just trying to show you what it takes to go from like 0 to Docker, and we'll go in a little bit more into detail. Mm-hmm. Okay, so my thing is running. Oh, I'm sorry, my image is built, right? How do I know that my image is built? If I do Docker image, I think it's list. Is it list? Okay, Docker image list. Here you can see Docker test, right? We built it 23 seconds ago, right? So I just built an image, right? So we have our first image. Now, the next thing I want to do is actually run the container. So I want to do Docker run, right? And then I want to do a couple of things. I'm cheating a little bit, I know. Don't get mad at me. I like cheating.
I don't even know that you're cheating, so,
That's fine. So what I'm going to do, Docker run name, right? So you tag images and you name containers, if that makes sense. Both of them, you're just giving them names, but again.
Well, hold on, because I saw in the output that there was like an actual tag, right? Like there was a repository column and a tag column. So is tagging not just like, is it tagging similar to like tagging in a Git repository where like I give it a version? Is that what we're saying?
You could look at it exactly. It's exactly like that. It's exactly like having a version, right?
Okay.
So
great.
So it's almost like because when you Docker build an image, it's like you're literally thinking about like creating build artifacts. When you create a build artifact, your build artifact could have a version. Right. So like you see like there's this other container that's here. Yep. This is version 0035, right? Like that's their version. If you don't specify a specific tag, you know what I mean? Like it's just gonna go to latest. Yeah. Okay. Let me show you. So let me show you how we can change it. Since we kind of wanted to talk about that a little bit, and just to answer your question. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to build it again. I'm going to give it another name. I'm just going to call this. Let's just call this another Docker test, and I'm going to do something like this. I'm going to put colon version 0.0.1, right? It's going to do the same thing again. It's going to build the image, and now if I do Docker image list, right? Do you notice how the 001 is here now? Right? Yeah. So I named it, I tagged it with this, and then I also have a version, right? And the version shows here under the tags. This was the first container we built, the Docker tests, but because I didn't give it a version, like I didn't give it like a number, you know what I mean? It just puts latest. And so you always get latest by default, if that makes sense, right?
Yeah, that makes sense.
If you do nothing, your images are going to be called latest. Okay, so, all right, so, and then another thing you notice we did too is that we just created two containers. They're the same image, or they're the same artifact, but we can name them different things, right? And you could do that for instance, let's say, hey, I wanted to build this version of my API and have this feature turned on, and I want to build another version with this other thing turned on. Like you can do that, and then you can just name them differently and tag them differently. So again, you also have that option too. You know, it's like creating a copy and like tweaking a setting, right? Think about it like doing something like that. Okay. All right. So we just built an image, right? And so now I want to run the image, right? So kind of going back to what we were talking about. I want to run the image, and if you recall, it's running on port 5009, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I want you to run this image. I want to give it a name of, let's just call this Docker test. Let's see, what else do I want to give it? I want to give it a port. So the port it's running on is going to be 5900. Now, the syntax I'm doing is interesting. So the syntax I'm giving here, I'm saying -p 5900 59. I'm sorry, 5009 5009.
Right.
Why am I doing the syntax like that? Remember I said in the beginning that containers are isolated, right? When they run on your machine, you can't get inside the container. It's like it's running, but like, you know, it can't see you and you can't see it. It's just kind of running in an isolated space. So for me to get into the container, I have to specify the port, right? So the port that this app was originally running on was 5009, right? And the port is running inside of the container is 5009. So what I'm saying is I want the container port and the host port, my machine, to be the same. Does that make sense?
It makes sense, yeah.
Okay, so that's all this is doing. All right, so I want to run this. I want to do that, and then I'm going to do a --rm. What --rm says is that when I'm done running the container, I want you to remove it, right?
Ooh.
So that means like if I just wanted to run it one time, run it, and then remove it. What you can do, you can run it and not remove it. But if you don't remove it, that means that you can start and stop it again if you wanted to.
What's the default behavior?
The default behavior is just gonna it'll start and stop, and then you'll see it's still there in your thing, right?
Yeah.
And I'll show you what the UI looks like so you can kind of differentiate it in a second, right? So we're gonna do that, and then I think the last thing I need to do is I need to specify. Let's see, why is it showing me that stuff? Oh, 009, and I think the last thing I need to specify is just the name of the container, if I'm not mistaken. So Docker run, blah, 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 blah. And the name of the container should be Docker. Why is it not showing me my thing? Am I missing something? Docker run. Hold on, I need to cheat. I need to cheat a little bit. Cheating is good. I'm missing something. Name, port, right. I need to get the name of this thing, right? What's the name of that thing? The name of our container should be Docker test, right? The name of our image.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, the only thing you're missing is the tag to run against.
Right? We're going to run this. Unknown -n. Oh, you know why? That's why it's not working.
Oh, do you have to explicitly?
I was trying to do it the shorthand way. It doesn't support shorthand. There we go. That's better. Now, if I do this, it should run, right? Mm-hmm. And then notice, so like these are the logs from the container, right? Mm-hmm. They don't look any different, right? It looks like it's from my machine, but it's actually not running on my machine. It's running in the container, right? How do I know it's running in the container? If I go to the Docker dashboard, I'm going to open this up super quick. And you see I'm in containers here. I see Docker test. Yep. And then notice it shows the ports that it's running on, right? Yes. So this is what's running now. This is running on 5009. So if I go back over to this thing, right, if I clear this out of my terminal, I'm going to do a curl on that same request. I should be able to get the same app running, right?
Right.
So again, the same app that was running on my machine, the difference now is that it's running inside of a container versus running on my machine, right? So first it was over there, now it's over here. All right. Now, you asked earlier, what is the default behavior, right? So if I come back to this terminal that's running my thing, I'm going to do like I'm going to do Control-C, stops the process. Right? Now that I've stopped the process and I head back over here, notice that the container is still there.
Yeah.
But it's not running anymore.
Right.
But the process, well, the thing that I built still exists. Okay. I can start it again. I can just hit this run button and it'll start running again. Okay. Or I can stop it again. Right? So now it's like a start-stop thing, right?
Got it.
Now you can think about it, and you can use this for a lot of different ways. Like obviously folks use this for deploying big, huge apps or whatever the case is, but you know what? Sometimes you might just want a little utility running on your computer and you could just build something, and then now you have a start-stop button, and you could just run it, right?
Right.
So now you have the options of running like these ad hoc tasks on your machine, and then also too, you don't have to worry about them messing up your file system unless you give it access to your file system. But that's another thing that we'll talk about. But so far now, I have a thing that's running, and I can start and stop my machine, right?
Okay.
Now, let's talk about the Docker file, right? So this is the thing that gives us the instructions about like what do I want to install in here, right? And like I said, like this default one from, I don't like how big this thing is. It's bothering me.
What are you trying to do?
What do I have this set at? The zoom level? Is it a zoom level? Let me put that back to 2.
Sure.
That's fine. All right, I'll do that. All right, so
I don't think it changed.
Was that?
I don't think it changed.
It didn't change? No?
I mean, it changed in here, but I don't think it changed on the Docker file. It doesn't matter.
Okay. All right, anyway, let's keep going. So the Docker file essentially is a set of instructions that tell you how to build your image, right?
Right.
When you think about a .NET process, right? When I want to build something, usually what I have to do is, I don't know, I might check it out of a Git repo. So I go and get it from wherever it is. I want .NET run on it, right? And at least for web apps, I might say, I want you to .NET build this, and then I point it to a folder. The output of the build goes here, right? Mm-hmm. And that's generally what we do. And so essentially, this is what's happening in this file. Like I said, like these files that we get from the default templates have a lot of extra stuff that you might not care about, but we're gonna go through and see like what's the stuff that's actually important. So for you to actually build an image using Docker, you have to have like a base, right? The base essentially is kind of like, what's the operating system and what's the default set of stuff that you're gonna be building on, right? And these are technically other containers, which is kind of crazy when you think about it, right? So like this is another image from Microsoft, right? They have their own ASP.NET as a base image, right? Right. And you have to have a base, you know what I mean? Because it's almost like, you know, if you think about like, well, how did the universe get created? Well, there was nothing and then there was something, right? And now we're all building on top of stuff. Well, this is kind of like Microsoft has created, you know, images for Windows, for ASP.NET, for, you know, different server-side things. You know, if you're a Python person, Node person, whatever, you can pull out a base image, and inside of this base image, you can say, hey, I want this image, and this is the version, right? Now, this might look familiar a little bit because it's almost like I was saying something like from Docker test version 001, right? Remember we did that earlier, and we created, I think ours was called like another Docker test or something like that, right? Like we had a thing that looked something like that, right?
Right.
So the difference is, you know, we're not pulling it from our image. This is a base image from Microsoft, right? Because Microsoft makes .NET, and so they create base images for .NET.
So it's almost like an inheritance stack for your Docker bits, right? So like if I want to make sure that this is the base install for all of my Docker bits, I can just use it, and then that's the way to go. Okay, yeah.
Right. And so, and if you think, and I can show you where these come from because they're all on GitHub, so you can look at them.
Yeah, I've seen the Docker files.
So what's inside of this essentially is ASP.NET and .NET are already installed in this base image, right? So notice at no point in time did I go to Docker and say, Docker, I want you to install .NET. I didn't do that. I didn't have to do that because it already exists inside of this base image, right? So I'm saying, okay, use this base image. I have base images for 6.0. I think there's autocomplete on this thing. Yeah, see? Nope. No, there's not. There used to be autocomplete. But anyway, you can go through and you can use different versions. I could use .NET 5, .NET 3.1. I don't know if the 3.1s are still there. I think .NET 7 is in there now, at least the like the preview editions, right? So if you wanted to test your app against those different versions, you can do that if you wanted to. So okay, so I have my base, right? Like this is ground zero. This is where we're starting from. Inside of that image, I'm using wkdir. It just creates a directory. You know, it's like make dir. This is work dir, right? Make a directory called app. This container is going to expose ports 5009, right? So far, so good. And then env is how we specify environment variables, right? And for folks, if you do ASP.NET, you know, you can configure ASP.NET with environment variables. So if there's, you know, certain things you want to set, you can set this. I can also do, you know, env, ASP, ASP.NET Core, instead of URLs, I can say environment equals to, I don't know, production, right? Like I can do stuff like that. Like this is just setting environment variables, right? I could set this to, I don't know, development if I want, like whatever it is that you want it to be, right? But then now ASP.NET picks that up automatically. That's not a Docker thing. It does that on your local machine too, right? So again, this is not a Docker thing about what this environment variable is called, but like being able to set it in the container on that environment. This is how you do it, right? You use that env command, right? Run is just like you running arbitrary commands in the container. Now, this is a point where it's important for you to know what kind of container you have, right? Why do I say that? Because if you're running a Windows container, then you probably want to be running like PowerShell commands versus this is running more like Bash commands, right? Because it's assuming that it's running, it's assuming that this base image is based on a Linux image and not a Windows image. And you can get Linux and Windows images if you wanted to, right? There's no Mac OS images because Apple doesn't do that, right? But if you wanted Windows or Linux images, you can get those things, right? And so that's what's happening here. So this is just creating a user, right? Again, we don't really need this. This is not super important for what we're doing. But again, like I said, like sometimes these images come with like extra things and you can trim it out, right? So I have a base image. Now, this is another image. Notice this one is the .NET SDK, right? So it's saying, okay, I want the .NET SDK, and I'm going to copy my Docker CS project. I'm going to copy it from my machine into the container, right? This is how we're moving data from your machine over now. Copy it over to the container, run .NET restore, and then I want you to copy everything else. I don't know why they do 2 copies. Personally, I would just copy everything in one go, but to each their own. But you pretty much is just copying stuff from here, like my folder that I have here, Docker test. It copies everything that's here, and it moves it over into the container, and it runs a .NET build, right? I notice it does .NET build. I want to run the release build configuration, and then the output is app/build, right?
Hold on, because I think you just tripped me up. Can you scroll back up a little bit to like line 13? There we go. Okay, so now this is the second from in here. So if I'm looking at this as like a domain-specific language specific to Docker, right? I'm looking at this as a single Docker file isn't necessarily just one image, because like we said, like right, like it's really technically I can pull in multiple types of images and then run the things against those images as needed.
You can if you want to, right? And that goes into something called like a multi-stage build, right? Okay. So like your build has different steps, right? When you say your build, let's think about building software in general, not Docker. Right. Building software, you have different steps, right? And different parts of the process you do different things.
Right.
The difference with building with Docker now is you're not just creating an artifact, but you're creating an environment too, right? Because you have a isolated thing that you're going to run it in, and it's not, you're not just going to get a zip file with like some files in it, right? Some DLs in it. You're actually going to get an environment that it's running in, right? And you can move that around. Right. So one of the purposes of multi-stage builds are it allows you to make your Docker files a little bit smaller by only, allowing you to only ship the things that you need, right? So again, let's talk about .NET, not about Docker. If I'm running .NET, right? If I'm hosting .NET as like a .NET host, I don't have the .NET SDK installed on the machine, but I have the .NET runtime installed on the machine, right? The runtime and the SDK are not necessarily the same thing, right?
Correct.
Like I don't need MS Build, I don't need the compilers, I don't need that other stuff, but I do need the runtime, right? Like probably some of the other things that are necessary. So all that's happening, imagine us doing that inside of a Docker file. So ASP.NET here, this has no SDK in it. It's just able to run ASP.NET Core apps. It has the DLLs and packages and what have you, like the NuGet cache and all that stuff that you need to run basic ASP.NET things, right?
Right.
This is the .NET SDK. So this is what we're actually building on, right? So what's happening here is that I'm copying my files into the container and I'm building them in that container with the entire SDK, right? And this part here, this part is important. Notice it says as.
Yep.
Right. So from this container as builds. So I'm giving that environment a name, right? And the name is just build. This one has a name of base. Right?
Got it.
Base is the thing that we're actually going to run on the executable.
Right.
Build is the thing that we're going to build in, right?
Right.
So again, imagine we're on our own machines. I might build it on the build server, but I'm going to publish it to Azure, right? I'm going to build it on the build server. I'm going to publish it in some VMware VM somewhere, right?
Right.
Imagine that world condensed into a little tiny file, and this is kind of what's happening here, right?
Okay.
So this is your build environment, technically, right? Imagine it's your build environment.
Yep.
Copy my .NET stuff, put it into this SDK image, and build it.
Got it. Yep.
Okay. All right, cool. So now that's built, right? So now that that's built, right? Now it's going to do a .NET publish. You do .NET build, .NET publish, right? If you're .NET, if you're an ASP.NET person, you know you got to do these two commands, right? So now when it does a publish, right? .NET publish, I'm pretty much just going to say, hey, put the publish stuff in here. So after it's built, usually when you do build, you probably run tests and do stuff, right? Inside of the publish, okay, these are the files now that I need to send to my host. I need to send to Azure or my hosting, you know, what's that place called? To GoDaddy or wherever it is that you host your stuff, right?
Right.
This would be a similar step in the world of Docker, right? So there you go. I want you to send the publish. Now here at the bottom is the part where we say, okay, from base, you remember where base came from? It was that is the environment that we're running on.
Yeah, the ASP.NET environment. Yep.
So from base, I want you to copy from publish, right? That's the environment we put the stuff in.
Right.
And I want you to put it in this folder in base, right?
Right.
So you publish. So I had an environment that I built some stuff on, has the SDK and all of that stuff. I want you to take the artifacts from that, and I want you to put it in base.
Right.
Right. And then in base, entry point is pretty much just like saying, I want you to start, like when somebody runs this, I want you to run this, right?
Right.
And I'm doing .NET, you know, Docker test is just the name of the DLL because that's the name of the project. And now it's going to run this, right? So now that's how essentially that we have these steps in here. Now, one of the things that I like to do, and obviously everyone is different, like when I do run, you know, sometimes I might want to have like extra stuff installed on my machine because it's helpful for me for debugging purposes. So I might do something like run, right? And so remember, when I do run, I'm doing stuff like inside of the actual container, right?
Right.
And not on my machine. So if I say run, I might do something like what's it called? Apt-get install, apt-get update, and this is bash. Assuming this is running on a Linux machine. I'm going to do apt-get install curl vim vi vim whatever, right? Like now I'm like, hey, I want you to install these additional things too, right? Because you know what? Maybe my container starts, but then it fails. I want to be able to go into the container, right, in that isolated environment and then run commands. I want to be able to view things in Vim. I want to call, you know, I want to do stuff to be able to inspect the environment. But again, by default, it's a very thin thing, right? It doesn't come with like all the tools. And so if I know, hey, maybe for development or diagnostic reasons, I might want to add some additional things to that. Right? And I want you to go ahead and install those from it. And so this is an option that you have. So, and I do that a lot in like, you know, my own containers that I craft, right? But there you go. So now you can see how we go from top to bottom, you know, start to like Docker container kind of thing.
Right.
So now, like this is a very simple example. Now I want to show you a little bit more of a complicated example, but I'm going to pause to see if, I'm just going to look and see if anyone in the chat has questions. I know we got a couple of people watching. And then Rodney too, if you have any questions, let me know. If not, I'm going to switch over and show you like a little bit more of a complicated demo.
Yeah, no, I mean, this seems pretty straightforward. Like, it's just a different way of thinking about it, right? Because, like you said, normally you would do your build and your publish on a build server, but like you're just pulling that inside the Docker runtime to let Docker do it for you. And you're using a domain-specific language to interact with Docker in this file and kind of just do all your jazz. So now everything from building to testing to deploying is just kind of done right here for you in the Docker file using Docker's command line interface via this language. Yeah.
And again, you can use Docker files in build servers. You know what I mean? Because obviously you can have your build servers that create containers and put them somewhere. And so that's also, you know, available for you too. Now, this other demo I'm going to run, I'm going to leave this here. So this other app that I have is a little bit more complicated. I don't have it running yet, but I want to show you what happens if I want to run multiple containers at the same time, right? So again, if you think about a container as like a single process, and not a single process, but like essentially like it does one thing. Like that that container that we just built only ran my ASP.NET Core app.
Right.
But like I might want to have other things inside of a container too, like Redis or RabbitMQ, or I have Seek in here. I've got MongoDB in here. I have all kinds of stuff in here.
Yeah.
Right? So this file is a little bit different. This file is called and I have a lot of things folded, right? Just because I don't want to show you the whole file and people freak out, right? But this file is called a Docker Compose file. And with a Docker Compose file, what I can do is I could specify the name of the image. And then again, I could set up environment variables and things of that nature. But the benefit of it is that I don't, like with a Docker file, I can have I create one image from a Docker file, right? Or one container from a Docker file. With this, I can have multiple services and I can be like, start all of these at the same time, right? So this is what I'm going to do.
Time you can start them at a specific time, right? Like, so yeah. So basically you go from building one thing to building multiple things and basically deploying an entire environment as opposed to just deploying the web server.
Exactly.
Okay.
So inside of this, and this is also a little bit of personal preference too. So I usually have two Docker Compose containers. I have two Docker Compose files. I have one Docker Compose file that has all of my infrastructure things. So when I say infrastructure, again, here you can see I'm going to create a MongoDB image. Again, we don't have it yet. I haven't run it yet, but when we run it, I'll have it. I have it here creating like a RabbitMQ thing. And notice I'm specifying, again, see this is the name and the colon and the version, right? Like that's the image tag that we spoke about a little while ago. I'm specifying environment variables and ports and stuff like that. And I have, again, just stuff, right? Like there's things in here that I want to have run, right? And, because we're using Writer and we all love Writer, I have what's called I just have a Writer configuration. And Writer has support for Docker Compose files. Right? I could show you what that looks like super quick. I can just go down to like the Docker thing and see they have Docker Compose here as an option. So that's the thing if you wanted to use it. But all I'm doing is that, hey, I have a Docker Compose file. I call it infra because it was my infrastructure one. I just pointed to what file I wanted to run, right? And then I just run it, right? So I'm going to hit this run button really quick. It's going to go ahead and spin up. What you're going to notice here at the bottom in the build window, because you're like, why is it building, right? Remember, it has to build the images, right? Or it has to, I have the image, it has to build and run the container. So what it's doing is that it's going out into outer space and it's bringing MongoDB to my computer, bringing Rabbit to my computer, it's bringing Redis and Zipkin and Seek and all the things on my computer, but it's going to run them all in an isolated environment. And guess what? At no point in time is it going to put anything into /user/local or /user/bin or any of the folders on my computer. Like at no point in time is any of that stuff ever going to be on my machine, right? Well, it's going to be on my machine, but it's never going to mess with my local file system, right?
Right.
But I can configure these things. I can try them out. I can swap out different databases. I could try different message queues. And again, remember I told you about how we bind to local ports? Here you can see I'm binding to a local port, right? The first one is my port. The second one is the container port, right? So now I should have these things on my machine. I'm going to use like the tooling that's inside of JetBrains Writer a little bit.
I was actually going to ask about that. Is that default tooling or is that a plugin?
I mean, when I installed it, came with it by default.
Okay.
It is a plugin, but it's like sometimes some of the plugins just like come turned on.
Yep. Okay. Yeah. Awesome. It's bundled. Yeah.
Yep. See, it says bundled, right? So it's there by default. So you don't have to do anything special to get it. You'll get updates.
Nice.
Now, all of those services, right? All of those containers, all those images that I showed you that was defined in my compose file, you'll see all of them here, right? So there's the Mongo one, and there's Rabbit and Redis and Seek, and right, like they're all there, right? And the good thing about this is because I forget stuff. So I just create this file, and if I need to use it for another project, I just copy the file. You know what I mean? So I don't need to remember all of these different things that are inside of here, right? I just, again, I write my infrastructure, quote, unquote, write my infrastructure once, and I can just move it around. So if I need to use Rabbit or Redis or whatever in a different project, I just copy this part and I take it over to a different compose file, and then hit the run button, and now I have stuff on my machine.
Do Docker Compose files allow you to compose from other files? So could I do a RabbitMQ and just dot source the file from in here? Is that a thing? Because
no, but
okay.
but on the command line. So if I ran this on the command line, you can do overrides. And so the Microsoft tooling does it a lot. If you do it in Visual Studio, is that you'll have a Docker compose.yaml and then a Docker compose override.yaml.
Yeah.
And so based on which one is what, it's kind of like similar to how you have app settings.json in .NET Core, and then there's app settings.production.json, app settings.development.json. It's kind of like that, right? Like, so you can specify multiple files, and then one file would override some values of the other one.
Got it.
Right? So if you wanted to have multiple, you could do that. So you don't specify the file in the Docker file, but then you can specify them on the command line, and then they'll override each other. So that's a possibility. Okay. So that's running. I just want to show you super quick, if I go here, that this stuff is actually running on my machine. Actually, let me see something real quick. Again, I forget stuff. So I just want to see what port. This is running on ports 8191. Yeah. So if I go to localhost 8191, right, I should have seek. Great. Oh, look, I have logs. How amazing is that? Right. And if I go to port localhost 15672, and I think it's demo. Don't steal my password, please. It's mine. Right here, I have RabbitMQ. I have a queuing system. I have that. I have my logging system. I've got Redis. I got MongoDB. I got all kinds of stuff running on my machine, and all I had to do was like hit the run button. Right. Obviously, I specified the ports and stuff. Now, this is just my infrastructure. And like I said earlier, like I have two files, right? Like I have my infrastructure file, and I also have my my app file, right? So this is the one that specifies my actual .NET app, right? So here, this one looks a little bit different, right? Because here you notice that I'm not specifying an image. What I'm doing is that I'm telling it, this is the Docker file I want you to use to build my application, right?
Got it.
So it's not going to go into outer space and download it like it downloaded Redis and Rabbit and stuff like that, because those aren't mine. That's not my code, right? That's someone else's image, right? But I do have my own Docker file, right? This is what my Docker file looks like. Notice it's it looks a little bit different to the Microsoft ones, but and I'll walk you through this and talk to you about how is it different. But then here's how I say, hey, I want you to look in this folder. I want you to use this Docker file that's in this folder. And I want you to give me these ports. And that's it, right?
So this is what I was expecting of the infrastructure, right? Where I can say, hey, I have like a RabbitMQ file. Go source the RabbitMQ file and use it in this Docker Compose file. Like, so you can do it, but you can't do it. It seems like you can't do it with the infrastructure as easily as you can do it with the actual, like.
Well, you can do it. I mean, so I can put them all in the same file. I just don't like to do it, again, personal style. I think it gets messy. And then also too, when it's in two files, I can stop one file and not stop all of it. You know what I mean? So think about as you're iterating throughout your application, I might want to stop my application, but I don't want to stop the infrastructure, right?
Right.
So that's one of the reasons why I keep it in two files. But no, you can't really reference them in different places. One thing I do try to do, let me see if I can show you this. I want to show you. Can I show you this? Right. So I have this .env file, right? And so if you wanted to share configuration, so to speak, I can just create this env file. Notice here I'm, changing the ASP.NET Core environment, kind of like I was showing you in the Docker file, but in this case, I'm going to do it in the Docker Compose file instead. And I can set these environment variables. And so now whenever I run this, I can reference that env file. So all of those environments are going to go in there. So if, I don't know, maybe there was like a Redis thing or Rabbit thing or whatever, and you wanted to kind of share that in between, I think configuration files, particularly like .env files, are a good way to do that.
Okay.
It's an option.
Cool.
So that's one way we could do it. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and run this file now. As you can imagine, I also have a, excuse me, what do you call these things? I also have a configuration for this. So I'm going to run that super quick. And so now my app is going to run. So now what's happening and what's different now is that one is building all of my .NET projects. And while that's building, I'll minimize that for a little bit. Let's talk about like what this project is. I have 3 projects in here, right? It's a little hard to see, but believe me when I tell you, there's 3 projects in there. There's a server one, there's a Blazor one, and then there's another thing called an order processor, right? Now, the Blazor application, if folks are familiar with Blazor, the way you usually build a Blazor app is like you have a project for your Blazor app and a project for your backend, and then they build together and create one output. Generally, is what folks do. So how do I do that in my Docker Compose file, right? How do I take two projects that are in two folders, the same root folder but different subfolders, and build them together, right? And I want them to build in one image. And so that's why I was talking to you saying like my Docker Compose file is a little bit different because I want to reference different projects. Because if I just do .NET build, it's going to be like, hey, you copied me over, but you reference like two other projects and they're not in here. Like, where'd they go, right? So I got a copy of it. So again, kind of thinking about that. So this part of the Docker Compose file should look fairly familiar, right? We kind of spoke about this.
Right.
Here's the base image. Here I was showing you, like, I like to install stuff. So here I am installing JQ because I like to use JQ.
Yeah, it's
right? Specifying the port, right? And then again, remember the build image, right? This one has the SDK like we talked about.
Mm-hmm.
But then now my SDK, I'm like, okay, there's multiple projects here. So first thing I want you to do, like copy, create a folder for the Blazor thing, copy it over. And notice I'm copying the CS proj to that folder, .NET restore, and then copy stuff over. Pretty much all this is doing, this is just copying Blazor stuff, right? I haven't done the build yet. I just copied stuff over.
Right.
And now I create a folder for the API backend, and I'm copying stuff over, right? This is all this is doing. Make the directory, copy it over, right? Do a .NET restore. Now I'm actually doing a .NET build, right? But when I do a .NET build, it's going to do it on both projects, right? Because one project is dependent on the other one.
Right.
So when it builds it, it's going to be like, okay, I'm going to look for that relative directory. I'm going to go one step up. Oh, there it is. It's going to build the Blazor thing. It's going to build mine. And now I'm going to have like one output that's going to go to /publish. And then we have this base image, right? And so the rest of this should look familiar. But again, like I said, one of the things you'll notice about mine, like I don't really care about users and stuff. You can specify users if you want to. And there's we can go down a whole rabbit hole of talking about Docker security and yada, yada. I don't really want to do that right now, but you can do that. But here, the important part is showing you that, hey, if I have, I don't know, when you're building Xamarin apps, I'll use this as an example. You might have like a Xamarin app itself, and then you might have a separate shared project for models or services or whatever.
Yeah.
It's kind of like the same thing, right? Like there's multiple projects in the solution, right?
Right.
But because I don't want to copy the whole solution for this container, right? I'm just copying the things I need, and then I'm going to build it.
Right.
Right. There is another Docker file in here. This other Docker file is a different application. So because it's a different application, it has its own Docker file, right?
Right.
So I'm not building multiple applications in the same Docker file, right? And so this one has a different ports, and this one is only one project, right? So I copy the stuff, I build the stuff, I run the stuff, all done. Okay.
Right.
So now my stuff should be up and running. Let me check the. Is it running? Yeah, things should be running. Looks good. Let's look at the logs real quick. Let's see what these logs look like. Okay. Yeah. So this is running. Let's look at the web app. Okay. Cool. Serial log ASP.NET Core request logger. That's running. So what port was this running on? This was running on ports. Okay, this is a different app altogether. 5772.
5276.
5276. All right. So let's go to the app. Localhost 5276.
Loading.
And boom, there we go. Here's my project. I'm doing stuff. I can click around. And this is all running inside of a container, right? This is not my app. This is running in a container. So I'll just, I'll click around a little bit. I'll move around. I'll do some stuff. Yada, 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 yada. And I should be able to see, I don't know, in Seek. Let's reload this super quick. I'm doing centralized logging in Seek. What time is it right now? 12:31. There we go. 12:31, right? Like there you go. I have logs coming in, API/available and things of that nature. So I got centralized logging. I'm using Seek and Serlog for those folks that care and want to know. I got a MongoDB thing in here. I got a Redis thing in here. I have all kinds of stuff in here. But the point is, like, for me, I can use containers to create an environment that looks very similar or close enough to what production might look like. Now, for some folks, you probably are not going to run Rabbit out of a container. You probably have some hosted service like Amazon MQ or Cloud MQ or whatever, or you might use Azure Service Bus. You might have other things that you're using. But at least for local development, being able to run infrastructure without having to go to the cloud every time is useful for me. And also being able to install stuff quickly and not have to be like, Rodney, how do you set up this thing again, man? Like, where's this configuration file? Oh man, I had this in my last repository. You know what I mean? Like,
yep.
For me, the ease of getting started is faster because now I can just be like, oh, just run this compose file. Like I can give this to you, right? I can be like, here, Rodney, take this compose file. You could just run it, and then you just have the environment, and you wouldn't have to do anything, right?
I actually want your compose file for the Seek stuff because that's stuff that I actually use.
Yeah, sure. I could. Yeah, man, you can have it. All yours. You know what I mean?
But like this shows a lot of promise. Okay, so like for somebody like me who's been doing mobile for the past, don't know how many years now, I think like 7 years, and remembering what back-end web was like at a time, does this kind of change the development life cycle at all? So like I get that this is like an interesting tool to do certain things with, to install, like because we used to have a shared state service bus that you used to have to ask around the team whether or not you could use it for development to write code against, right? So like, okay, now I can bring my infrastructure locally and I can do all my dev locally. Great. But is there now additional value where, to your point, I as a developer can deploy this site to my local environment as though it is production, and as a result, I can verify my changes, didn't break anything, or like, is that something that people is that the way people use it from a development like life cycle perspective? How do I as a developer get the most value out of this tool?
Sure. So if you kind of go back and remember when we were talking about like tagging, right? We talked about tagging in images and stuff like that. And here are the images that we pulled down, right? Like we pulled down Rabbit and Mongo, and here's the ones we built and some of the ones we downloaded. One of the things that you can do, particularly when you're thinking about your own images that you're building and your own containers that you're running, is that a lot of folks use it for like A/B testing. Again, like I'm going to run a thing, like here's the base, or here's the foundation, or here's the, I don't know, like the control, right? Like if you're talking about like doing, experiments and stuff, like here's the control. And then now I'm going to have, this deviation and this deviation and this deviation. You kind of run them all together. And a good example of how folks can use this locally for distributed systems. Imagine like you had like a request coming in and you want to test your load balancer. You know what I mean? Your load balancer can be an image, right? Assuming you have a software load balancer. Some people have hardware load balancers, but if you have a software load balancer like Nginx can do load balancing. Yarp has a load. The reverse proxy for .NET, that has a load balancing thing. So you can say, okay, let me test my load balancing, right? And you could send a request in and then point it at these different containers, version 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever. And you can say, hey, I want 50% of the load to go here, or 50% to go here, or 75-25, or I don't know, 25-25, whatever you want to do. You can set up your thing to go, and then now you can see, okay, well, my load balancing works, and how am I handling it? And oh, can I look at my logging? Is my logging showing me like these different environments? And then when I look at my logs, can I differentiate what environment is coming from? Great. So now when I go to the cloud, I'm going to expect something similar, right? Because, a lot of cloud folks, they're going to spin up and spin down environments. And a lot of that, particularly if you're doing serverless or something like that, sometimes that stuff is very dynamic. How can I replicate like that environment on my machine?
Right.
Again, for people that are doing distributed systems development, not only for them, but then just using them as an example, it's been hard to test these systems because a lot of the times you have to, I got to spin up a VM, right? I got to get permission to the cloud account to spin up these things. And sometimes these things are expensive. It costs a lot of money, right? I got to get licenses and seats and all that types of stuff. Or I can just test my theory here on like something else. Again, I got Redis, I got RocketMQ, NATS, whatever you want to use. I'll be like, okay, I want to test the algorithm. I want to test the theory. I want to test like my logic between, okay, how do I create a workflow that like hops from one service to the other? You know what I mean? Like, and I'm utilizing different things and I'm jumping all around because the backend requires me to do that.
Right.
You know what I mean? How can I, folks might hear about like, deadlocks and consistent state and all this types of stuff. Hey, what if I make a request for some stuff, but like my data hasn't propagated all the way around yet? Like, eventual consistency. How does my app react to that? Well, I can create an application and I could simulate eventual consistency, right? And so now I could see, okay, well, this is how my app deals with it. You might build a mobile app and you have an eventually consistent API, right? Maybe I submitted an order, but like by the time like you come out of that screen and you switch to another one, you just query for status, it's not ready yet, right? Like, how do you simulate that, right? And not simulate it as, oh, I'm going to write a code and write a unit test. Like, how can I have a real environment that actually does it? And I'm going to simulate that cycle, and I can do those types of things. And again, not like you couldn't do them before, but it's easier because you don't have to set up the world. You just set up this container or this Docker Compose file with multiple containers, and then your team can share it, right? So your team can share the eventually consistent environment. Like, I can give you the Docker file. Like, everyone gets a Docker file, right? Like, I think we could just hand them and share them around the team.
Yeah.
But again, no, we're all working against the same environment. Or if you want to make tweaks to your own, obviously that's available too. But again, when you want to spin up multiple things at the same time, I think it's very valuable, at least when it comes from a team perspective. I think as an individual developer, and I want to try stuff out, it's useful too. Again, when I was first getting started in messaging, and I wanted to try out Azure Service Bus. I was just learning Azure Service Bus. And what happens when like the electricity comes off? I live in Florida, so that happens, right? What happens when your electricity comes off? Or what happens if your internet goes down, right? That means I got to stop working, right? Because I can't connect to the thing. Well, what if I could just run it in a container and I could just do it, right? What if I just had SQL Server running in a container and I could just do it? And I don't have to worry about connecting to the company thing over VPN and yada, yada, yada. I could just connect to it, right? And, assuming that I have the same version of SQL Server and a somewhat similar structure, like obviously you're not going to have your customer data and stuff like that on your personal machine. But if I could say, this is what the world looks like, and I populate it with some fake data, and I can craft scenarios, and I can run my system through these scenarios locally in my machine. And again, I'm not talking about unit tests, but I'm talking about like more end-to-end functional testing. Then you can be like, okay, I have more confidence when I put it out to production because I've tried it in these different scenarios locally, and this is how it works.
Yep. Yeah. No, this seems like it has a lot of power. I mean, even just from the fact that I can tweak individual dependencies and see, like, let's take Mongo for example, right? Maybe we notice a performance issue in the latest version of Mongo, and we can spin up 2 environments and run some actual tests to see whether or not our theory is correct. In days past, we would have to add logging and turn around 3 times and stand on our head and pray that we could get some information that would solidify our thoughts. But like now, we can actually just spin it up locally and test the thing and figure it out. So this seems like it's an amazing tool for any developer that's doing any type of web-based interaction.
Yeah, for sure. And kind of even to your point with using Mongo, right? Like, notice like the versions are pinned, right? So like this is Mongo 057, right? Like I can go and pull a different version of Mongo. But then what will happen is that like that version of Mongo that's here, it's not going to delete it. It'll just add another one.
Right.
So now on my machine, where's Mongo? Right. So now on my machine, like I could just, install like another version. Like here are all the versions of Mongo.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Thank you, JetBrains for the IntelliSense. This is JetBrains IntelliSense kicking in. And they're querying, the repositories. I could try all these versions of Mongo, right? Here's a Windows version, here's 3 whatever.
Right.
I'm sure, again, I could scroll until Kingdom Come, right? Like there's all of these different versions that we could try out. And you could be like, hey, this version is giving me issues. Let's just roll back, right? But the good thing about it is all you have to do now is change the version, keep the name consistent, and your app doesn't need to care about it. Your app doesn't need to know, right? It's the same thing. As long as obviously it's the same port and the same data. But, with Mongo, it stores the data externally, right? And that's what we're talking about. I was going to talk about volumes. And this is probably going to be the last thing we talk about real quick. But with volumes, I can say, okay, my container is running, but like here, I want to give it access to folders on my machine. Right? And that's what volumes kind of do. So with Docker Compose, I can do it like on my machine. If you're running in like Azure or AWS, you can point it to like what's that thing Amazon has? S3 storage. You can put it to an S3. You can point it to blob storage.
Got it.
You can point it to files or what? You can point it to a thing, right?
Right. Some shared state somewhere.
Some shared state, so that when the container shuts down and spins back up, it's going to be pointing, again, your configuration is pointing to the same location, right?
That's nice.
So it'll have access to the same data. So if I shut down everything now and spin it back up, right? Like if I was to shut down Seek for whatever, and I spin it back up, if I come back to Seek, where'd it go? Come back here. If I come back to Seek, it'll still have these logs, right?
Okay.
And it'll have those logs because I said in my configuration file, now here you go, I want my data folder. So Seek automatically stores data folder in Seek. This is the data folder on my machine, right?
Yeah.
So my machine, Seek. So anytime you see like a left and right pairing, it's your machine and the container. Just like with the ports, left, right pairing, my machine, container, right?
Got it.
This is my machine, this is the container, right?
Got it.
And so, and might not be able to see this. This might be too small, but like if I go to, is it the file system? File system, I have this temp folder. It's grayed out because I have it ignored in my git ignore file.
Right.
But here's all the Mongo stuff. And if I open this, here's all the documents and stuff for Seek, right? Like they're there. So when I shut it down and spin it back up, it's gonna be like, oh look, there's the volume. I'm just gonna load it as I boot up, and all this right.
Wow. So my only understanding of Docker containers before today was like I've used them to run like Mongo instances and Raven instances locally to do some playing around to try and understand how to match the API surface. But I've also done some stuff with Seek where I'm looking at mobile logs on my actual machine and piping it out to Seek so that I can see it in a consistent view. So now that I know that I can do a Docker compose file and set it to a volume outside of the container, that changes the entire game and actually makes this a usable tool for my development team to figure out if we're because we're looking through production logs day in and day out, right? Hey, I can just download all my production logs to a single folder, let the Docker container have access to that folder, and then just load it all up and let it fly.
Yeah,
that's really nice.
Yeah, for sure. And again, so maybe not the last thing. This is gonna be the last thing. So the question for most folks would be like, okay, well, where do the containers come from, right?
Yes.
Now, by default, they live in this thing called the Docker Hub. So it's hub.docker.com. And so this is where you'd go to and search for containers. So if I wanted to look for, I think it's called Data Loss Seek. Isn't that what it's called? Data Loss, there we go, Data Loss Seek, right? And so one thing I would say is like, just look at the documentation and see how to run it. So here's how you would run it in just Docker without the Docker compose file. Remember we did that on the command line, Docker run, and I give it a name, and I give it some ports and some command line stuff. But then again, you could kind of scroll through here. You could see like the different environment variables, things to set. Like here it says, I'm using like the free version. So I got to accept the EULA, so here it is, right? I accept the EULA and user license agreement. There's the base URL. And again, you can look at the memory limits. Like you can set all kinds of stuff, right? And then when you want to know, well, what versions are available, at the top here is where the tags are. So remember we talked about tags. When we build the image, we give it a tag, right? By default, there's always the latest. But, here's a preview one. There's a 2022.1 preview, blah, 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 blah. Right? Like you can try out the preview releases. You can try out the old releases. You can try out the RTMs. You can try out whichever one you want, right? Like if you want to go back to 2020, sure, do that, right? You can go back to the 2020 version of Seek if you want to do that for whatever reason and try out those older versions. You can pull in those containers and they're all available on Docker. So if there's a thing that you want to look for, I don't know, let's say we want to look for CouchDB, right? Isn't CouchDB is a thing, right?
Couchbase.
Yeah, Couchbase. There we go. Right?
Yeah.
Here's Couchbase, right?
Yeah.
And now one of the things that I always tell folks to do, because anyone can publish an image, right? It's kind of like NuGet, you know what I mean? Like it's kind of like a NuGet package repository.
Mm-hmm.
You always tell folks to make sure you try and look for like verified images. Like this is actual Couchbase, and see it says Docker official. You know, it's like the verified tag on Twitter. Like we know who you are. Like we trust you. So unless it's like
verified tag on GitHub, right? Like I know that this commit came from this person or this package came from this organization. Yep.
Yeah. So like these green ones are usually like from Docker itself. That means that Docker itself built the image. But then you see these ones, blue ones that say verified publisher. So these are the ones that are built by the company, right?
Got it.
So Docker itself publishes some images, and then companies, again, like Microsoft and Google and Couchbase and MongoDB, they publish their own images as well, right? So you'll see
Nice.
those. So again, as you're looking for stuff, don't like just download some random image from some person you don't know, right? Like make sure there's like verified images, because again, you're still running a process, right? And the last thing you want to do is run a process and give it access to a port, and then it does something crazy, and then you're like, Cecil told me to run the process, and I'm like, I told you to check for that little blue check mark, man, like, because you don't just pull packages from anybody.
Yeah.
But there you go.
Awesome. Yeah. No, this is...
So I think that's a pretty, for me anyway, that's like a good high level view of like how I look at containers and how I like to use them. Again, for me, it's more about, sure, like the distributed computing thing and, you know, server density and blah, 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 blah. We could talk about all of that. But for me, when it comes to building locally, it makes it really easy, because now I could just be like, oh, okay, I need a thing. I need a Rabbit. I need a Mongo. I need a SQL server. I'll just spin it up and I'll point it to this folder and it'll load the data, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't mess up my file system, and I don't like, look how quickly I spun up all of these things. Like I didn't go and download a thing, right click, next, okay, put it in this folder. You know what I mean? Like I didn't have to do all of that. Like I just gave it to Docker and be like, Docker, figure this out when it pulls this. It just kind of makes it work for me.
Yeah, the speed is amazing, because like I remember the first time I ever installed the Redis cache, I had to go out to the web, create it, do all this, like, and it's like, oh, it's just, it just does it, and it's quick. Like that's the main thing, because like provisioning a machine back in the day, you know, you'd be waiting 2 weeks for a machine to come back.
Exactly. We don't got that kind of time these days, man. I mean, we got things to do. So, yeah, for me, it's a productivity and a time saver thing for me, and then also too, when it comes to like testing more complex scenarios on the backend side, I think it's useful for that as well. Cool. Well, folks, I hope you all enjoyed that show. I had a lot of fun, and hopefully y'all learned some cool stuff. We don't have a show scheduled for next week, but we will let y'all know when we schedule some more of these. I think we all agreed we're not going to be streaming in December, because, you know, all of us are going to take a moment to kind of like step back a little bit and, you know, kind of spend some time with the family and do those types of things. So we will be streaming a couple of days in November, and then we'll be back again sometime in January. But if y'all like this, let us know. Leave us a comment. Let us know about any topics that you might want us to talk about. Yeah. If you want to learn more about containers and how we use them, and, you know, maybe someone wants to come on and talk about Kubernetes, or I don't know, what else do people use, like Azure Container Apps, or what's that Amazon one? Elastic Container Service, EKS, I think is what it's called. If you want to talk about any of the container things, feel free to come on. We can talk about it. But I guess until then, thank you so much, and we'll see you again next time. Bye, everybody.